thank you for introducing each other to each other, and I'm sure you learned a lot, as I have already, from meeting people vicariously through other people as a way to sort of like help you guys introduce each other to each other, right? So thank you for participating on that exercise. But I'm curious also to know, as you were listening to the bigger group, as people were sharing, what was it that you were hearing? What started to jump out at you? This is a question to everybody, so feel free to just unmute yourself and respond to the question. So what were you hearing as people were starting to talk?
One thing I noticed was an overall consensus, or there appeared to be a want for opportunity across the board. And I mean, it articulated out in different ways or similar ways with everyone here, but like that was the thing that stood out the most to me.
In addition to that, I noticed that there was that young people had trouble communicating or approaching one another, and also this competition within identity. And I feel like that plays into the opportunity aspect, because if you can't socialize amongst yourself and amongst each other, and you don't have a grounded understanding of who you are, there can be a difficulty, receiving and recognizing opportunity.
Thank you for that.
Well, I noticed a difference, which would probably come across more divisive. I noticed that most of the guys from the global north, they seem, most, not all, they seem to see the concern being about being maybe closed-minded, or for the youth, issues of identity, maybe. Whereas I did notice a consistent thread amongst the South Africans around issues of unemployment, etc.
Yes, I noticed that as well. Yeah.
I guess I could add to that. I would say that we show, like, as a whole, an interest, and we care a lot about others' experiences. And I think that alone, that curiosity, can spawn a lot of new understandings about one another, and going forward, being more open to opportunities, being more open-minded to others. So I think that's very encouraging.
I saw a lot of head nods, which means everyone is sort of like agreeing to a lot of what everyone else is saying.
I guess I'm curious as to, well, Ninke mentioned this point in our breakout discussion, how there may be opportunities, but access to them may not be there. And I wonder if that trend is something else that other folks are seeing globally, like, or in our respective geographies.
Sorry, if I could just add on to that. Not add on, because Yancy, you've got it down. But just say that in terms of access, I've always been very interested in the idea of access, right? So one can go to a space that you couldn't go to in the past and still feel removed, still feel alone, even though you're in the space. I think we have an idea of economic access where, okay, we can get into this space and it looks good, all glitter and gold around us, but we still feel like we're alone there. And it's also a question of how to bring people who relate to us, who can see us human beings, into this space so that we have someone to talk to. So I've been to places where it was never about access because I was sitting at the table. It was about being seen as a human being, having a human experience. So Yancy, definitely, that's a point that you highlighted for me, and thanks for bringing that up.
That's such a good perspective, like a powerful insight that you're bringing in there, Anthony, around access. And our access is not just, entering a space, but it's about being seen in the space. I'm curious to know what it is, because I think now we're starting to touch on this a little bit, but what is it that maybe you were expecting to hear but didn't hear in the room as people were speaking. Maybe we're sitting with our own expectations of what, you know, what we'd hear from the discussion.
Right.
I see Anthony. Yes.
Just one more point. I really wanted to know if your Big Mac is like our Big Macs, because I feel like I need to know if we're being swindled. So at McDonald's, are your Big Macs the same? And this should be high on our agenda. So that was just heavy on my chest. So anybody can clear that up in the.
Thank you. I love that. So if people didn't hear the question is, are the Big Macs the same, basically across continents? I personally feel like our Big Macs are small, but I don't know. I haven't been to America, but I'd like to hear as well.
I'd never ordered that, and I think that they're small.
I agree.
Okay.
They're pretty small.
As someone who I lived in both countries and I've had Big Macs in both countries, I can confirm. I think the American one is a little bit bigger, but
Aha. There you
I do
go.
think so. I do think.
Great. Okay, what else are we sitting with? What expectations? What would you want to hear that we didn't actually hear from the conversations today?
So something that I kind of was expecting was what Anthony so gracefully calls the kumbaya approach of Ubuntu. And generally, I do kind of expect that someone is going to mention the almost kumbaya definition, but which is not wrong. But it's very cool to hear these kind of very rounded, multifaceted approaches to a very complex philosophy. And it was very cool to hear about it in so many different ways.
Thank you, Kristen. I want to know about what it is that you wanted to say but didn't actually say. Is there anything that you because of either time or because of, I don't know, is there anything that you're still sitting with that you would have liked to share?
I guess something, I guess more broadly, at least coming from a perspective from United States, like the concept of, like I was talking with Samira, but like the concept of Ubuntu is like something that's, I don't know, pretty radical. Well, no, it's not like, it's kind of like really interesting coming from a culture that's in the United States that's hyper individualistic, and that like these understandings of connectedness and like togetherness, at least as a, sort of like a social ideal, is like really cool and fascinating, and something that like I think especially like for people here in the United States who are in our little boxes, I think we can, I don't know, one thing is that I'm excited to hear from everyone is just sort of hearing this concept flesh out and just seeing like, what can I take away, as like someone from a completely different cultural context.
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Jonathan. I'm wondering if anyone else, before anyone else chimes in about, what they wanted to have said, if anyone else connects to what Jonathan has said about the differences, or at least, yeah, the cultural difference between like individualism, which is basically, I'm generalizing guys here, global north stuff, yeah, and then the more togetherness vibes, like the global south. So would anyone like to connect to what Jonathan has said in regards to that? I saw nods. I love seeing nods. Yeah, and say, let's go.
I definitely would just like to say, I definitely experienced that a lot with my conversation with Ninke as well. We were talking about how like her definition of community and her experience of community varied entirely from what my definition and experience of community was. And like we were just sharing different experiences and how like her neighbor, she could depend on her neighbors to, look after the house or something like that, as opposed to my neighbors. They would probably call the police on me for walking into my house. They would think that I was breaking into my own house. So it was just, and they would still consider that themselves protecting the community and doing their part for their community. And so I found that very interesting.
All right.
And so a quick addition to the individualistic society thing, which I thought was a really cool observation. And also the fact that, we still have a fragmented society in South Africa, and that there are still many parts of the South African society the various communities that I would almost hesitate to call communities, because the definition varies so greatly from like, I mean, I have friends whose community is literally their whole family. And in my community where I grew up, it's like you just live in proximity with each other. So I find that quite interesting, how I think individualism or the individualistic mentality is seen in small pockets. And how can we sort of bridge Ubuntu into those communities as well?
Thank you. Yeah, I'll try to keep it quick. It's also just linked to the last point, and specifically with the sharing of Ninka's view of, you know, being able to rely on your neighbors. I thought that was interesting and linked to what Kirsten said. I don't have that experience, and I actually told Jonathan, as much as we have this idea of Ubuntu and everyone thinks, oh, you know, it's all about this community, and we maybe have that here, and it's a very radical concept in America, but I personally don't feel like I have that sense of community here. So I thought that was interesting also in terms of the differentiation of experiences. And then also just quickly linked to that, something that Jonathan had also said, and the way he framed it, he spoke about, he joined this to understand what's other from us. And I thought just in terms of the framing of how you understand, that's also important, because I've been reading up recently on this idea of othering and how often we view, you know, us versus them, and the way you construct the distinction between different people and different contexts is also really important.
Thank you. When you speak, I'm actually thinking about, this is just me putting in my 2 cents for 2 seconds, even though the space is not for me, but you make me think about a phrase that came up was Ubuntu as nostalgia. It's almost like there is a sense of wanting to hold on to something that used to be and maybe integrating it into the present. And so I'm connecting what you just said, Samira. Thank you. Anthony, and I think Pearl wanted to say something at some point. Anthony, go first.
Look, let's take it back to COVID-19. So it's all good and well that we're sitting with our families and we're sitting in like what we would call the lounge, and we're watching like a series or something. But I distinctly noticed that even in COVID-19, if somebody's going to get to coughing, then I'm going to start analyzing the space, even in my own family, right? And I'm going to look around and I'm going to go, are y'all sick or are y'all not sick? So it's very interesting for me to see that when we're faced with danger or we're faced with crisis, we tend to retreat into our own selves and make sure we're okay, right? But I think what ought to be challenged is the idea of Ubuntu even in the midst of crisis, Ubuntu even in the midst of challenge, right? So I'm not saying we shouldn't see who's coughing or detect like symptoms or not wear our masks, but I'm just saying that usually when you're faced with danger, your true colors start to come out. And I mean, are the values, can they be pushed to that extent? So yeah, so even in my own family, I was looking around to see who was coughing, who was sniffing, because not me, not today. But all right.
Thank you. Thank you. As I'm also latching on to how COVID-19, as you bring it up, is very isolating. It highlights or almost encourages a kind of individualistic approach to being together. It's like, cough over there, don't come here. Yeah. So anyway, love the humor.
Yeah, so I was going to say, I feel very protective about the ethic of Ubuntu. I come from a village. Originally, I live in a village. My dad is a chief. It's very much something actually we live, and it's something. And so for me, it's very interesting when I hear about conceptions of Ubuntu as kumbaya. I'm like, no, Ubuntu is about sacrifice. And as much as it's lovely, but it's largely about the individual dying to self in order to serve community. And even thinking about what you guys were saying, in COVID-19, our experience of things, people came to a point where they were willing to actually contract in the villages, to contract this disease that might kill them, rather than be ostracized from each other, because life is to be together. Where I'm from, So it just got to the point where it was kind of like, okay, then don't leave the village because people were just not going to not be together, you know.
Thank you. That was interesting, CJ. Also, just to add on what some of my South African fellows have actually mentioned, it's also very interesting, like what Anthony was saying about COVID and how some of the things that we noticed about what exactly is Ubuntu. South Africa does have a very, very it's not necessarily the whole kumbaya thing that's happening. You don't experience the whole Ubuntu everywhere you go. I personally don't know my neighbors. I've never seen my neighbor ever since I moved here. That happens. Just to also something that is also quite interesting during the times of COVID in terms of us becoming very individualistic in a sense, where a lot of chaos was happening where school kids were supposed to go back to school, where there was a big divide between the private school and the public schools, and it was the private school kids that went to private schools they were actually getting the education they needed. But then when the government was talking about how this should apply to all schools, there was a big fight that was happening. And then that's something that one could actually kind of look at, because for me during that time I kept thinking about how if you have a neighbor whose child goes to like a private school, or I mean who goes to a public school, can't those kids actually come along and actually get to learn? But most of those things were actually not happening in some of our communities, in some of our urban areas. Everybody just wanted, there was a lot of UNAs actually happening in some communities, not in every community, just to say that. And I agree also with Cesar, like Ubuntu sometimes is definitely a thing of being selfless in a sense, and within my experiences working within the police environment, where people are not very selfless. It's like the system is broken. What more can we do? But then you're like, but here I am to serve. I gotta serve. So it takes that kind of selfless act to actually put yourself in the line to actually do something for somebody else. So yeah.
What I'm hearing from today's discussion, especially right now, is, of course, this is why we're here, it's about Ubuntu dialogues, but what I'm hearing from the issues that youth are facing today and some of the perspectives that you're bringing in today is possibly an idea of how Ubuntu could remedy some of these things and what that looks like. What does it actually mean to do Ubuntu, right? And this is part of the beginning of what could possibly be. And again, like today, we were just emphasizing a meet and greet, but it's also an opening of more conversations and more things to say and share and learn from each other. And with that said, for next week, I would like to invite you to just jot down what else you are still sitting with that you feel was unsaid by yourself and perhaps those that are in the room today. So I'd like to start how we ended. I'd like to end how we started, just to be mindful of people on the space and just thanking them with your eyes, with your smile and your presence. This was such a rich experience. First dialogue that we are literally zooming into. So just appreciating the faces in the room. Yes, and just say hello with your eyes, or goodbye with your eyes this time, because we're ending, we're finding a closing. And then slowly bring that awareness back to your body and slowly begin to extend that awareness to your surrounding environment, because we've been sort of glued to the screen for a while. So just be aware, we're about to greet the physical space again. Yeah, and with that is it for me for now. And if Upinga and Mariki don't have anything else to say, this is literally the end until I see you next week, Tuesday. Thank you so much for this conversation that was beginning to brew. There's never enough time to talk about these things, but I'm so really glad that you started to bring up some of what we can work with moving forward.